A few years ago, a movie by the name of Paranormal Activity became the most profitable film ever when it made almost $200 million at the box office on a $240,000 budget. The movie's gigantic success did something not even the Blair Witch Project phenomenon managed to do 10 years before. The first Paranormal Activity launched found footage as a legit horror subgenre that spawned many other movies and another 6 entries in the franchise itself. But then here I was thinking to myself the other day, why did almost none of these movies reach as much notoriety as Katie and Micah's Quarrel with the Devil? I mean, aside from PA sequels, I guess we had Cloverfield, which by the way came before the wide release of Paranormal Activity, Chronicle, The Visit, The Blair Witch. I really can't think of anything else that generated any kind of buzz, and I mean any kind, because besides the PA franchise and Cloverfield, these other movies were not that popular. And the little popularity they had is not that hard to explain. The Visit comes from M. Night Shyamalan and The Blair Witch is a Blair Witch movie. And keep in mind, I'm talking about buzz, about the mainstream. So these random thoughts started torturing me, and after a couple of days of practicing transcendental meditation to keep me from jumping off my balcony in frustration, I think I got it. I think I have it. I think I know why none of these movies got any attention from audiences. And before we start, I must tell you, I like found footage films. I'm a big horror fan and I like found footage movies. There, I said it. I'm aware and agree with almost everything bad people say about these movies. Yes, there are long periods of nothing going on. A lot of whispers and shouting.
I'm so sorry.
Josh!
Lots of shaky cam.
Just run! Just run! Let's start running right now! Let's start running now! Run!
Rely heavily on jump scares. And they all end in the same way, but I still like them anyway. I guess you can call it a guilty pleasure. I don't know. Anyway, the reason found footage fails as a genre is quite simple. It is simply because found footage cannot be a genre. At least not in a traditional way. But seriously, it is a trope. Found footage is supposed to be a horror movie trope. The shit isn't supposed to be a full genre by itself. It doesn't work. You see, every film genre has their own characteristic writing, acting, soundtrack, lighting, and cinematography. And what that means is that you know what to expect from a movie after 2 minutes. You may not notice it, but your brain does. Now, every genre has a bunch of subgenres. In horror, we have haunted house movies, slasher films, and zombie movies, just to name a few. And each of these subgenres has their own particularities. In a haunted house movie, for instance, the individual or family move into a new home, weird noises happen, ghosts appear, family fights the haunting, the end. On a slasher film, you have a group of usually teenagers being taken out one by a masked killer. People fight the killer, and his identity and motives are exposed. On a zombie film, people try to survive and rebuild a society amidst the chaos of a world taken by hordes of mindless flesh-eating monsters just to see it crumble yet again. You get the idea. And the reason why I'm talking about screenplay is because it's usually what is most perceived by general audiences. But despite following certain patterns, you can do whatever you want with your characters, plot, mood, tone, and theme. Shaun of the Dead is a zombie comedy horror about friendship. Final Destination is a slasher film in which the killer is destiny, or death, or whatever, and The Shining is a haunted house, or hotel, movie about a man's descent into madness. The point is that in any other horror subgenre, you can mess around with all these elements. You can mix them up and subvert the living Ryan Johnson out of them, like The Others, or Saw. And sure, many movies in a genre or subgenre will stick to the same tropes and cliches over and over again, without any attempt of making it slightly unique, and we call most of these movies bad movies. But then let's take a look at the found footage category. Let's go back to the 2 main entries in the entire subgenre. The original Blair Witch was an idea that directors Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick, Eduardo's friend, came up with while both of them were students in Florida. The duo realized they found supernatural documentaries to be far scarier than actual horror films, so they decided to make a movie that would emulate a documentary about the legend of the titular Blair Witch. The cast would be made up of actors who had strong improvisational skills and or could work a camera, as the entire movie would be filmed by the actors themselves and the lines and actions would be improvised, with the directors only providing written general instructions about what was supposed to happen to the characters on that day. The filmmakers would then use small festivals as test screenings, using the feedback for further editing of the film. Also in these festivals, Sanchez and Meyer would show up and talk about the film as if the events were true, handing out missing people flyers to the audience and urge people to come forward with any kind of information about the missing students. There was also an official website with material about the disappearances, and the IMDb page for the movie listed the actors as missing for an entire year following the movie's release. Now children, let me tell you something about the 90s for those of you who weren't around at the time. It was a very, very different time. The internet was something people would go on the computer. There were no camera phones, no YouTube, and Google was not the information hub it is today. The internet as a whole and information were immensely less diffused. If the filmmaker said the movie was true, there was a website saying it was true, and the IMDb said it was true, then it was true. Because you see, access to the internet was not as trivial as it is today. So even having access to this kind of information was like having some kind of insider information. So it was like, hey, did you see that movie was true? Yeah, I saw it on the internet. And that was it, at least for the bulk of moviegoers. You didn't have Reddit, you didn't have Heather Donahue's neighbor posting a video on YouTube to say that everything was a hoax. There were no leaks of anything. The movie then went out to make almost $250 million at the box office worldwide and is known to this day for its ingenious marketing campaign that used mouth-to-mouth and the internet in a time where it could disseminate information in a very limited fashion. For almost a decade after the release of the Blair Witch Project, nothing of notice used the found footage technique on the mainstream or even on the underground except for Cloverfield and Wreck, and then this trailer made it to movie theaters.
Gonna film, whatever happens. Hopefully, once we get on camera, we can figure out what's going on.
Please, people of your boat.
Katie!
The Paranormal Activity trailer engaged audiences on its marketing campaign at a time where social media was taking off and online interaction was starting to become what it is today. The huge success of Paranormal Activity spawned so many movies that it made found footage go from a trope into a proper genre in just a few years. And if found footage was something relegated mainly to the direct-to-video market, now we would see release after release at movie theaters. Even with well-known directors like M. Night Shyamalan and Rennie Harlin surfing the found footage wave. Now, any movie genre is passive of fatigue. If you watch too much of anything, you eventually get tired of it. The problem is that with found footage, that fatigue comes extremely quick because virtually every single goddamn movie has to be the exact goddamn thing. I mean, just look at the Paranormal Activity franchise, for example. It is the exact same movie over and over again with different actors and a marginally different plot. And to understand why these movies are always the same, let's take a look at those elements I mentioned before. Number 1. The plot. Horror movie plots, even the weirder ones, don't usually stray too far from the 3-act structure. But that's beside the point. The plot in found footage movies is about the only thing you can actually change in these films. And those quotation marks are because even the plot has boxes to tick. You can tell pretty much any story you want as long as it includes A. Someone documenting some kind of unusual event, usually paranormal, and B. Either everyone dying at the end, or at least the camera guy dying, and the audience not knowing what happens to the rest of the cast. And then you can say, duh, of course someone is documenting something. It's a found footage movie. The footage has to be made and the footage has to be found. Yeah, no shit. The problem is, when in every single one of these stories you have to set up a situation where the characters need to document something, you're already putting a lot of restraints on your story. There are only so many situations where documenting the events would be plausible. It's either aliens, ghosts, or disturbing behavior. There's not much else you can do with it. And this by itself is almost always a subject of controversy in these movies. In almost any found footage movie, the inevitable question comes up. Why are they still filming this? Why would anyone still be filming any of this? Number 2. Characters, dialogue, and acting. Having good characters is no easy feat for any movie. Especially horror movies where the main focus is almost always on the ghost, the killer, the zombies, whatever. They are the main draw to any horror movie. There is no way around it. To make a good character, firstly it must be good on paper. That's the easy part. Then you need time. You need to make him or her react to enough situations so the audience can build up who that person is in their heads. There are no character descriptions in movies. Our entire perception of the characters relies on our interpretation of the character's actions when presented with conflict. And those actions, of course, are presented to us through acting and dialogue, which in turn, in a found footage movie, have to also be extremely limited to mainly whispers,
So I've decided to spend Thursday afternoon following him around.
scares, shouts, and screams.
Wait a stop! Just wait a second! Just wait a second!
Because in found footage, you generally have two options for the way these stories are told. Aside from the very brief character introductions in the beginning of the movie, in which we often see very little past character archetypes, the story is either told in snippets and we will only see the characters when they turn their cameras on, and there has to be a realistic reason for that, or the cameraman character is documenting an event in real time. In both scenarios, characters have to react realistically to something that isn't supposed to be real, and this makes the range of possible reactions incredibly limited. Characters are almost always in a fight or flight mode during the entire film, and this makes it very difficult for something peculiar or unique to come from any of them. There's often one and only one possible emotion for our characters: fear, because these are supposed to be real people reacting to bizarre situations, and found footage first and foremost has to look realistic. So, by design, you can't really have unique acting, dialogue, and characters in a found footage movie. Number 3. Soundtrack. Number 4. Lighting and cinematography. They all have to look the same. They have to look realistic. That's it. All scenes have to look like they were shot by someone who has little to no camera experience. And that includes lots of shaky cam, shots of nothing and long periods of nothing happening. And the environment has to be lit as realistic as possible for it to resemble a real-world location. Out of all the main film elements, these are probably the ones that are most tightly restricted by the genre. And let's not even get into editing, because it is virtually non-existent. The editing in these films is almost entirely made up of cuts and effects to make it look like amateur footage. Bottom line is, when you take all these elements and tweak them in the way found footage requires, you end up with a subgenre where every movie looks, sounds, and feels the same. And let me tell you, I think most of them, or at least the ones I saw, do a pretty good job in looking like legit found footage. But then you can ask me, okay, Mr. Watcher, then how come we do remember some of these movies if they're all the same? Why do we remember Blair Witch, Paranormal Activity, Cloverfield, Wreck or Quarantine, Chronicle, The Visit, and maybe even Searching? Well, let me tell you exactly why, my shaking cam loving child. First of all these movies came out with some time between them, and when we're talking about fatigue, this is a very important point. Then the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity were products of great marketing strategies that made great use of festivals and the internet at the time of their release. The other ones like Chronicle, Cloverfield, Wreck, and Searching are somewhat remarkable because they are entries that made something somewhat different. And I don't mean it in a complicated filmmaking perspective. I just mean that they are about different things. Cloverfield is a disaster/monster movie. Wreck and Quarantine are zombie films. Chronicle is a sci-fi/superhero movie. And Searching takes place on a computer screen and is not even horror. You get the idea. The only film that I can think of that doesn't really do anything different but is still noteworthy is The Visit. And I think that's just because it is from M. Night Shyamalan. As I've said before, I like found footage. I recently watched The Last Exorcism after a while since my previous found footage movie. I always heard about it but had never seen it, and it was great. And to me, that's how found footage is supposed to be consumed. It is something you're supposed to see once in a while, and it works even better if it is an anthology like the VHS movies every now and then. The genre just has too many elements you have to reproduce just to make it found footage. This is true to the point where you have M. Night Shyamalan, a director with one of the most peculiar and recognizable styles in contemporary horror filmmaking, making his own entry on the genre, and you can even tell who the director of The Visit is. Any leeway you have to make the movie your own is almost non-existent, and the little you have is still extremely limited.